Hello, everyone. This week for Module 3, we are going to be diving in deep to talk about the federal system of our government and to talk about civil liberties. So, we're going to go through your lesson plan, which is the first document in Module 3, and I will be providing you with more lecture and in-depth information on these topics. And then in class, we will have some activities and more discussion. So starting with Chapter 3, Federalism, we're going to begin by thinking about the federal versus the state government and some of the ways that the powers are divided. So to start off, we're going to talk a little bit about enumerated versus reserve powers. So what's important for you to note is that enumerated powers are those powers that are designated as belonging to Congress, and they are detailed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which we will be reviewing in class. So they are explicitly given to the federal government, and they're laid out in very great detail. Those are the enumerated powers, and they range from the power to raise money by levying taxes to many other powers that the federal government has been given. And this was done in order to protect the federal government and try to make it clear that what the parameters of federal power were. The reserve powers are those that are given to the states. And basically, it's important to note that the reserve powers were created through the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which we will, like I said, be reviewing in class. And basically, the 10th Amendment explicitly says that any powers that haven't been discussed, that haven't been explicitly given to Congress in Article 1, then those powers are reserved for the states. So it tries to cover everything by making that statement. So enumerated powers are those given to Congress and the federal government. Reserve powers are those that are given to the states. The Constitution also details the powers belonging to all three branches, relative power among all three branches. So Congress is where the Constitution starts with Article 1, and that is because, as I mentioned earlier, the founders actually believed that Congress would be the most dominant branch. And they were given actually the most detailed set of powers through the Constitution. The executive branch is covered in Article 2 of the Constitution, and the judicial branch is covered in Article 3. Relative to one another, Congress has the most constitutional power. The executive branch has a moderate level of power, and the judicial branch is considered as having the least amount of power. But we'll talk about them, the specific powers they have in more detail in a second. It's also important to note just that concurrent powers are those powers where there is overlap between the federal government and the states. So you will have a handout that you will work with in class. You'll be able to see what some of the enumerated powers are and what some of the reserve powers are for the states, and then where the areas of overlap are. But there are several concurrent powers wherein there's usually a lot of grounds for conflict between the states and the federal government because both are allowed these powers to some degree. So for example, states are also allowed to levy taxes as well as the federal government. States are allowed to create judicial systems, as is the federal government. And so when both are allowed to have these powers, then conflicts arise wherein the states begin to say, we have the power to take this action, and the federal government can contradict that by saying, no, that power lies with us. And then it falls to the courts to decide which aspect of federalism, whether it's the states or the federal government, actually have the powers. So with regards to congressional powers, Congress has the power to create laws. That's considered to be legislative power. The power of the purse means the power to levy taxes and raise money through taxation. The power of common defense and general welfare is really important because there are many powers contained in that statement. So within the power of common defense and general welfare, Congress has argued that that gives it power to declare war. It has given it power to establish post offices, It's also given power to create the federal courts and to suppress insurrection. So there are lots of different activities that Congress undertakes under this general power of common defense and general welfare. Thinking about the executive powers, they have the power of law enforcement, which means they have the power to enforce the laws that Congress has created. The executive office also has power of commander in chief because they are considered to be the leader of the armed forces. So that gives them the power to be kind of the ultimate, to have the ultimate say over what direction the armed forces take. They have pardon power, which I covered a bit in class last week, but that's the ability to pardon those who have been, even people who have been convicted of crimes in the courts. The president or the executive office has the power to suspend any kind of punishment if they see fit. And finally, the executive office has the power of chief diplomat, which is the power to negotiate treaties and things along those lines with other sovereign nations. Now, thinking about the judicial system, their primary power lies in what we call judicial review. And that is the ability, whether it's on a state level or a federal level, to review actions taken by the other two branches, whether it's executive orders issued by the executive office or laws that are passed by Congress. The judicial branch has the power to review those actions and determine whether they are constitutional or not. So they're kind of like the keepers of the Constitution. And even though, as I said before, the judicial branch was considered to have a lesser amount of power, it has been said that Chief Justice John Marshall was particularly influential in co-creating the power of the judiciary, making it a co-equal branch, because judicial review can be used over both the executive branch and the legislative branch to determine whether or not their actions align with the Constitution. So even though the judiciary wasn't thought of as having as much power, over time the actions that the judiciary had taken have made it very powerful. So now thinking about some of the clauses in the Constitution that are actually used a lot to support federal powers. The first is the necessary and proper, or it's also called the elastic clause. And this article is actually in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1 of the Constitution focuses all about Congress. Article 1, Section 8 talks about the fact that Congress has the power to make any laws that are deemed necessary and proper, as I mentioned before. So this has been used many, many times over history to justify congressional action, because they will refer to Article 1, Section 8 and basically argue that because of the necessary and proper clause, Congress has the power to take specific actions. The second key constitutional clause is the National Supremacy Clause. This clause is detailed in Article 6 of the Constitution, and basically it states that the United States Constitution and federal law take precedence over any state laws. So you can you can remember this by thinking that the federal government reigns supreme over the state laws and any actions taken by the state. So thinking again about possible conflicts, the National Supremacy Clause is often used to resolve those conflicts by basically stating if there's any difference between the federal law and state law, and if the state law contradicts federal law in any way or federal actions, then the federal laws reign supreme. In class, you'll be covering your first debate, Chapter 3, Medicinal Marijuana and Federalism. So you'll be applying these concepts that we just talked about with regards to enumerated powers of the federal government and reserve powers of the state government, and those concurrent powers where there are plenty of areas of conflict. And you'll be using those concepts when you engage in your first debate. So this is an overview of what you'll be doing. Then we'll move on to Chapter 4, Civil Liberties. And we'll start by thinking about civil liberties and where they are found in the Constitution and why they're important. So it's important to note first that civil liberties are contained first and foremost in our Bill of Rights. And it's important to note that the Bill of Rights is constituted by the first 10 amendments in our Constitution. So you'll receive copies of the Constitution in class. And what we will do is have a chance to go through the entire Bill of Rights, all 10 amendments, and discuss their relevance and why they're important even today. So the Bill of Rights, constituted by the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, which actually comes after the Bill of Rights, is also really important with regards to civil liberties. Especially Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which it's referred to as the Due Process Clause. It talks about the fact that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is really useful, and the Supreme Court has referred to this due process clause to enable it to apply the Bill of Rights, even though it is in the federal constitution, our federal constitution, our national constitution. The Supreme Court has used the 14th Amendment a lot to apply the Bill of Rights to all of the states, so that it's not just the federal government that has to respect our civil liberties, but the states have to respect them as well. So you will be exploring the Bill of Rights in more detail, as I said, but this is just a little cartoon to kind of illustrate those 10 amendments. And there's a little bit of a summary for each one. In class, we'll review the full Constitution and we'll talk about each amendment in the Bill of Rights. So moving into exploring the First Amendment. This amendment is one of the key amendments of the Constitution, not only of the Bill of Rights, but of the entire Constitution. And one reason that it's so important is because it covers several different areas. The First Amendment actually covers the establishment of religion. Here, Section B, it covers freedom of speech. C, it also covers freedom of the press, the right to peaceful assembly, and the right to petition the government for grievances. All of that is contained in the First Amendment, which is why we're going to spend some time talking about it. So it's often referred to as the Establishment Clause. And one of the reasons that it's referred to as the Establishment Clause is because it talks about, first and foremost, about the establishment of religion. And what's important to note here is that Congress is, on the one hand, it is forbidden from establishing any religion that is affiliated with government. But on the other hand, Congress is also forbidden from establishing any law that would inhibit the practice of religion. So Congress is really expected to have a balanced view and take a balanced approach with regard to religion and be very respectful of it. So that's why it's referred to as the Establishment Clause, because it's very important to deal with the establishment of religion. So getting into that, achieving that balance, the Supreme Court has actually used the Lemon Test, what they call the Lemon Test, because it refers to a Supreme Court case where one of the participants in the case, the last name was Lemon. And it's important to keep this in mind and understand the three aspects of the Lemon Test, because this is what the Supreme Court uses to determine whether any acts taken by Congress violate the Establishment Clause. So the Lemon Test has three parts. The first question that the court asks is, does the law have a secular purpose? So if a law has been passed and it has been brought before the courts, and either it's been arguing as supporting the establishment of religion, or the plaintiffs may be arguing that this law inhibits the free practice of religion. First question the Supreme Court justices will ask is, does this law have a secular purpose? Which means did the Congress create the law with the intent not of dealing with religion, but with the intent of dealing with the everyday lives of our citizens? That's the first question. Second question, does the law have the primary effect of either advancing religion or inhibiting religion? So in practice, does this law end up either helping or hurting the practice of religion? The third question, does the law foster excessive government entanglement with religion? And that's kind of a general question because it can be hard to determine what is excessive government entanglement, but that's what the judges are trying to figure out. All three of these questions for the Lemon Test, they have to be answered in order for a law to be ruled as constitutional. So, does the law have a secular purpose? This answer has to be yes. Does the law have the primary effect of either advancing or inhibiting religion? And the answer to this has to be no. And it's important to remember both. You can't say, well, it doesn't advance religion, but it actually inhibits religion, because that is a problem as well. Third question, does the law foster excessive government entanglement with religion? The answer has to be no. And then based on these answers, the courts rule whether the particular law has violated the Establishment Clause or not. Now, keep in mind when we move on to freedom of speech, which is also contained in the First Amendment, um, the freedom of speech basically protects citizens' right to criticize government and officials or to express praise for government and officials. But usually it comes under attack if an individual or a group is criticizing the government. So freedom of speech in the First Amendment, that is what allows us to express views that are critical of the government. That is why that particular liberty is protected. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that you can even express political views if they're hateful, if they're hurtful, or if they're controversial. So just because people don't like them, people may actually feel hurt by the expression of your views. You may feel like those views are particularly hateful, but that does not prevent an individual from having freedom of speech. And one important Supreme Court case was Snyder versus Phelps, wherein the Supreme Court ruled that Phelps, he was the minister of the Westboro Baptist Church, and they made it a practice of holding public events where they would hold signs and basically express their views about the American government, about homosexuality, about homosexuality in the military. Several different views, were expressed by the congregants in this church. The church, led by Phelps, was taken to court by Schneider. That was a family member of a Marine who, was killed, and the Westboro Baptist Church picketed the funeral of this particular Marine, and they held up signs talking about basically expressing their views about homosexuality, etc., etc. So the Schneider family took Westboro Baptist Church to court, but the Supreme Court ruled that Phelps and their congregation, they have the right to picket the Marine's funeral because their signs dealt with national political issues. And so the First Amendment protected their right to express their views, even though it was seen as hateful, hurtful, or controversial. Now, one way to kind of complicate that is by understanding what is considered to be hate speech and what is considered to be hate crime. So, filling in this definition for you, hate crimes are crimes that are motivated by bias, that are based on race, religion, national origin, gender, or sexual orientation. So crimes that are motivated by those particular kinds of bias, those can be considered hate crimes. And the legislation increases the penalties for people convicted of criminal offenses that are motivated by these kinds of prejudice because the courts feel that when individuals commit crimes, it's bad enough. But when they commit crimes that are motivated by these kinds of bias, they inflict greater individual and societal harm than just a regular crime. So that's the reason why they have ruled that it's all right for the states and the federal government to increase the penalties for these types of crimes. It's also important to note that biased speech is constitutionally protected, where we talked about Westboro Baptist Church, for example, but violent behavior motivated by bias is not. So when individuals act and they make it clear that they're acting not necessarily as a result of, but their actions are informed by their bias, that is not okay, and that is when it becomes okay to consider the crime to be a hate crime. Now, still falling under freedom of speech is this idea of symbolic expression. So, in addition to actually speaking, sometimes individuals can express themselves not necessarily through words, but by engaging in actions and working with symbols to express themselves. And it's still considered freedom of speech. So, a few examples are they often deal with the flag because that's an important symbol of government. So, whether it is burning a flag or whether it is, using a flag for, to demonstrate your positive feelings, those are all considered symbolic expression. Also, use of religious symbols, so burning a cross, or even, doing something that's seen as disrespectful to other religious symbols, whether it's the Star of David, which is symbolically associated with Judaism, or the Star and the Crescent, which is traditionally associated with Islam. There are various religious symbols, and symbolic expression often uses those kinds of symbols. And whether it's using them in a positive way or doing something that's seen as negative, such as burning or destroying, it's important to note that symbolic expression is also considered free speech. So that is covered by the First Amendment as well. Now, going into freedom of the press. There is a quote that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. That quote was made by Justice William Brennan. And basically, what it's saying is that freedom of the press is considered to be a fundamental right, and it is protected whether the government or society likes and supports a particular idea or not. Now, freedom of the press can be limited if the issue is about distribution of obscenity. But in order to prove that printed material or any kind of media material is obscene, there are 3 criteria that have to be met. The material first has to describe or depict sexual conduct. Secondly, the average person, the courts would rule that the average person would find that this work appeals to an excessive interest in sex. And the third criteria for obscenity is that the work as a whole has to be seen as lacking any serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So all 3 of these criteria must be met in order for any kind of material to be ruled as obscene. So if any of these 3 criteria are not met, then the material is not considered to be obscene, even though some people may be offended by it, but it's still protected by the First Amendment. Now, another limitation on freedom of the press is this idea of defamation. And defamation is considered to be, it's defined as false written or spoken statements that lower a person's reputation or expose them to hatred, contempt, or ridicule. That's the definition of defamation. But it's important to note that defamation of public figures has a stricter standard, because individuals who are in the public eye, they also have to show, number 1, that a statement is false, number 2, that it lowers their reputation, and that the statement was made with malice or reckless disregard for the truth. So there's a higher standard for public figures in order to sue any kind of press outlet for defamation of character. The last point that should be made regarding freedom of the press is this idea of prior restraint. So if you think about material that is being printed, and we talked up here about the limitations on the distribution of obscenity. So these limitations, though, are really focusing on material that's already been created and produced, and then maybe after the fact, it can be found as obscene. This idea of prior restraint is addressing the idea that sometimes governments want to prevent the publication or the broadcast of material that they find objectionable. They don't want it to come out at all. And in order for the government to do that, because freedom of the press is so important, the courts have ruled that government can only prevent this if there are exceptional circumstances, such as times of war, and the government can prove that this material will be detrimental not only to individuals but to the entire country. So prior restraint is the standard for prior restraint is very high, and the government has to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this material has to be, it cannot come out because the entire country would be in jeopardy. So that covers freedom of the press. Now, the First Amendment also deals with this idea of peaceful assembly. And basically what peaceful assembly is just what it sounds like. It is the right for individuals to come together, whether it's for a peaceful protest, but also to join any kind of association that they want. And again, they can come together to express or promote or pursue or defend their ideas And these ideas might be supportive of government, they may be critical of government, but the freedom of assembly is still protected. The freedom of peaceful assembly. And it's important to note that peaceful is a key part of this term because assemblies, gatherings that have a violent intent are not protected under the First Amendment. Moving on, the freedom to petition government for any redress. That is also covered in the First Amendment. So the freedom to petition government is really defined as the right to either make a complaint to the government, to seek the assistance of the government without fear of punishment or reprisals, which would be kind of like revenge. So individuals or organizations have the right, and it is protected, it is a civil liberty, to make a complaint to the government, to communicate with their government and let them know when they feel that something has been done that is wrong or that is unjust. They also have the right to seek assistance of their government. So sometimes this is done with individuals reaching out to their state representatives, their local representatives, or their federal representatives to seek assistance regarding a certain issue that's taking place. So that right is also covered by the First Amendment. So the First Amendment, one reason that it's cited so widely and we hear it talked about so much is because so many of our civil liberties are covered in that one amendment. Now, we're also going to spend just a little bit of time exploring the Fifth Amendment. And one reason that we're going to do that is because the Miranda warning is actually an explanation of and supposed to be in support of the Fifth Amendment. So the Miranda warning is the statement that the police have to either read or verbally articulate to anyone whom they are putting under arrest. And you may have heard of it before. If you've watched Law and Order or any other police shows, you've probably heard the police say it at one point or another. So before questioning by the police, any accused person has to be warned of the following. Number one, they have a right to remain silent. Number two, any statements they give may be used against them, and they say can and will be used against them. And number three, they're entitled to the presence of an attorney, whether it's someone retained, which means an attorney that they're paying for, or an attorney that's appointed. Because if you cannot afford an attorney, as you may have heard, one will be appointed for you, and it's supposed to be free of charge. So that is the Miranda warning. Critics of the Miranda warning argue that it's problematic because it prevents law enforcement officials from questioning an individual right after they've committed a crime before they have a chance to create an alibi or to think about the consequences of talking to the police. So critics say it creates this buffer between law enforcement and those who they see as criminals, and it actually makes it harder for them to do their job. Supporters of the Miranda warning say that it's the poor person's Fifth Amendment. And the explanation there is that all of us, all American citizens are covered. We are covered by the Fifth Amendment. And so these rights that are outlined in the Miranda warning doesn't create those rights. The Miranda warning is just reminding us of the rights that we already have. So when they talk about the Miranda warning being the poor person's Fifth Amendment, what they mean is that educated individuals, middle and upper class individuals are already in the know. They are usually more familiar with their rights. And so whether this was read to them or not, they're more likely to know that they don't have to talk to the police. And so the Miranda warning isn't as necessary for them. However, for poor and uneducated individuals, the Miranda warning reminds them of the rights that they have because they're less likely to know this already. And that concludes Chapter 4 and our exploration of the Bill of Rights. So for this module, what we've covered are some of the powers that are detailed between the federal and state government. Enumerated means they refer to the federal government. Reserve means they're referring to the state government. And those that are shared by both, which are concurrent powers. It also covers the powers that are held by each of the three branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial. It covers some key constitutional clauses that support the federal powers that we've talked about. Where in the Constitution can Congress, the executive, the judiciary, the states, where can they go to say we have these powers and here's where the Constitution supports us and gives us those powers? the origins of civil liberties and some of the limitations on civil liberties. We will conduct a detailed examination of the Bill of Rights, and you'll have more opportunity to get into that in class. And then we've also had a detailed examination of the First and Fifth Amendments. Now, for Friday's class, you will also be covering Chapter 5, Civil Rights. So you can look for the second video, and in lesson plan, it'll be video 3.2, and that will cover civil rights just for you. So we will talk about some of this information in more detail in class, but be sure to use the outline to fill in your notes, because you will be held responsible for this information, even if it's not talked about again in class, because it's here in the video. So have a great day, and I will see you soon.